my comfort area is mathematics more than the law, but the law is intriguing. Harry is my friend of 48 years. Can you believe that? He's my political comrade, my intellectual and spiritual brother. I've been serving as a collaborator and advisor in his taking on court cases of political and social significance. He's allowed me to do that. And currently I'm acting as his aide in the vendetta, so-called good character hearing cooked up by the Law Society to administer professional capital punishment against the champion of the marginalized, poor, oppressed, and voiceless. Kopyto. Harry and I met as student radicals in the mid-1960s. We were involved in such things as the anti-Vietnam War movement, student politics, Fair Play for Cuba, the NDP Youth, solidarity with women's liberation, and the list goes on. Our politics were framed in terms of Trotskyism. I don't intend to explain all that tonight. Some of you know it, some of you may not. But basically it's an anti-Stalinist, pro-socialist, pro-labor mindset. I recall when the precocious Harry Kopyto spoke at a Young Socialist Forum, and we had to get extra chairs. Bark for this larger than normal crowd, and it was the first time I heard him speak. I was mesmerized, I have to tell you. I was mesmerized by his eloquence, pithiness, and formidable logic. He was, and still is, a charismatic figure, in the best sense of that word. He was a popularist without being a populist. He's no Rob Ford. He's his nemesis. Populist being a demagogue person who pretends to be on the side of the poor, the oppressed, or the common person, but mainly for political and personal gain. Harry was a popularizer, that is to say, he was an educator, and still is, trying to put into as clear terms as possible ideas that touch on the needs of people to live in a democratic society in a free and open way. I was also impressed by his exquisite and witty poetry. Most of it political, some of it just plain fun. And actually, it'd be great if you, I don't think Harry brought his poems tonight, but he talks about, one of his poems is about money, and another one is about weight. And anyway, it's very fun. I used to be a teacher in an alternative school in Toronto, and we used to run a coffee house, which was an evening in which the students and friends would entertain, and Harry was always on the agenda. People wanted him to come and read his poems, and he would write poems for the occasion, which on current topics. Harry's English professor, I think her name was Miriam Waddington, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. At York University, tried to persuade him to go into a graduate program in English literature. Instead, after being advised by his closest political collaborators, he chose to go into law as a means of carrying out important political struggles. That was a choice. That was a crossroads. Could have gone either way. Shortly after, Harry helped form the law union along with Clayton Ruby. It was a coalition of left-leaning lawyers and activists, and it was a breakthrough in concept from the self-serving lawyers establishment. It was an attempt to create a grassroots movement using legal expertise and activism. Henry was involved in defense of Dr. Henry Morgenthaler, who recently celebrated and recognized, who had been imprisoned for his work. And Harry was prominent in that campaign and getting other lawyers involved as well as ordinary citizens. He was involved in the campaign against the War Makers Act and all kinds of giant civil liberties struggles. He became involved with the first prominent gay rights case in Canada, that of John Gamey. I don't know if you might remember that case. It was quite a landmark. And it was the struggle that the way in which Harry approached it was really interesting. He used the court, and then he got to other people who were activists, and they started organizing at the grassroots level all the way out to the West Coast. And got great publicity, and the court was entirely inundated daily by the news and the activism that was going on, and it rocked the establishment. And gay rights were not widely accepted at that time. So this was very important because the court was a lever to create a wider political struggle, to create awareness, to educate, to mobilize. One of the follow-ups of that campaign was that the human rights codes were amended in provinces across Canada to include sexual orientation. You can thank Harry Kopyto for that. In the many battles Harry had with big law, he was regarded as insolent and an annoyance, but one that would not go away, and which would continue, and he would continue to scratch at the flea-ridden skin of the legal establishment. Some of Harry's most memorable cases, black nurses trying to get justice. Wheel-trans workers in the old days when they were driving unsafe vehicles and carrying people who were handicapped. Harry fought for them so that they could have safe vehicles and, of course, provide safety for the people for whom the service was being provided. The Velma Demerson case, which you probably all know about, this woman who suffered so badly at the hands of Ontario injustice, and for so many years had to live with that and was finally able to get justice. She was able to get an apology, an official apology from the province of Ontario. That was something. Harry did that. Bakery workers who were isolated in their small union and they're trying to organize it and work their way through the problems they were having. Harry gave them legal advice, but he said, you've got to organize. And he taught them how to organize. And that was one of his great achievements. And it continues to be Harry's approach. You've got to organize. It's not just individuals, it's people working in concert. There were many, many other struggles. I can't remember them all. What was common in all of them was fights for social justice, for providing the voice of those who felt marginalized and oppressed. He took on cases that other lawyers tried to settle in the back rooms or refused, cases thought to be unwinnable, and sometimes it turned out to be winnable. But most important, as Harry's repeatedly told me, people have a right to speak out and to be heard, to be understood. Whether they win or lose, they have the right to be understood, to give them a sense of dignity. The major case in which I was involved was the Nelson versus the RCMP. So very relevant today. In light of the NSA and Canadian government spying scandals, it's worse now than it was then. The situation is tame. By today's standards, the case was tame, but it created quite a stir. It was fought in the courts. It was fought in the court of public opinion. It had prominent signatories. I believe there were some in the States, some leading intellectuals that had signed on as well. Can't remember, it so long ago. It was fought at the United Nations. It was thrown out in civil court by Judge Zucker, the one who indulges in crazy glue. His reasoning, Judge Zucker, is yeah, they did the wrong thing, but they were well motivated. And Ron Ford did the wrong thing, but he was well motivated. Sound familiar? Sometimes we don't really know. And that's to his everlasting shame. Mind you, there was a reprise of the struggle when Harry had to take on Zucker again when Zucker was altering the transcript of of a trial that Harry was involved in which he made a very he scandalized the court in his comments about Harry. Anyway, he was punished by that, but rescued by the provincial government. But even there, the power of publicity shook things up, even when he was unable to win against in the RCMP case. But there was moral redress, there was voice, it was loud, it was expressed, and the establishment were outraged. They couldn't believe that somebody could lose in the court, go through all those processes, and have the temerity to say, this is injustice, this stinks to high hell. You can't say things like that, it's just not polite. Even if it's right. The Law Society of Upper Canada tried to scupper his career by trying to blackmail Angie, who was his legal associate, many years ago. They used dirty tricks. They disbarred him, finally, by using dirty tricks and deception. There was another lawyer, and I can't remember the exact case of a conservative establishment lawyer who did some things that should have gotten him disbarred, but he didn't get disbarred. Only Harry got disbarred. I mean, his was actually, as I recall, he was actively being deceiving. But good activist boomerangs, when thrown, relentlessly return to the sender. So the Law Society threw the boomerang at Harry Kopyto, and he's back at them. Today, Harry is fighting to maintain his right to practice as a legal activist. He's up against a powerful establishment who are once again trying to get rid of him by using discredited witnesses, phony legal pretexts, multiple panels, because they keep losing them, and exercising political privilege in the form of taking over their competitors, who are much cheaper to hire, paralegals, putting them under their umbrella, restricting these paralegals in their practice, so they don't compete as much against the lawyers, and putting them, thereby forcing Harry into this new organization, which causes him to be the subject of their scrutiny of his moral character. Harry is fighting back with skill and aplomb. For those of you who've been there, you can testify. Repeatedly, there is a public gallery, and Harry is facing that panel. It's a testimony to the fact that people support what Harry's doing. Harry forced the resignation of 2 panels who were clearly biased. They don't know what they're getting into when they deal with Harry. He sets snares for them, and they fall into it. God, you know what it is? They're not used to actually fighting somebody who knows how to fight back. We're now working on recusal of the 3rd panel, which is this recusal process has to do with a conflict of interest between the chair, Margot Blight, who represents exclusively corporations and powerful institutions against employees, and Harry, who exclusively represents employees and the oppressed. And this polar oppositeness has resulted in a conflict outside of the confines of the panel hearing, where Blight is representing one client, rich and powerful, and Harry is representing another, the victim, and now it's causing them all kinds of problems. It's David and Goliath. It's the irresistible force versus the immovable object, and you can decide which is which. It's my honor and pleasure to you, and your comrade and friend, Harry Kopyto, to be here tonight and to introduce you.
people tire of lectures in 10 minutes. Clever people tire of them in 5 minutes.
Raise the mic.
Actually, I'll raise my voice. You can hear me all? Everyone can hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, and there are some empty seats. First of all, I want to say that somebody asked me just before we started that they read about me, but they want to know why I do what I do. And I told them I'll explain it in my speech. Reflection is a retroactive process. Modern psychologists now agree that from the earliest moment of consciousness, even seconds after birth, the human mind strives to define its place in the social world. The question, who am I and how do I fit in, become the defining features of what drives us to understand ourselves and others, to define the self, and thereafter, through intricate stages of greater awareness, to decide consciously who we want to be and what role we want to play in our personal lives and social lives. Of course, the process is not mechanical. We are not automata, programmed passively by our life experiences to react according to a deterministic blueprint. Neither are we possessed with an unbounded free will of subjective choices in which our conceived agendas are forged in a social vacuum, in splendid isolation from the matrix of family and friends institutions and dominant ideas and cultures that constitute the society or societies in which we are born and grow. I was born in a displaced persons camp in Ginsburg, near Germany, in 1946. My brother and my parents were sole survivors of 2 large families. My parents together had 10 siblings. I never knew what it meant to have an uncle, an aunt, a grandfather, or a grandmother, or even a first cousin. Next year will be the 75th anniversary of the start of the Second World War, an historically unprecedented bloodbath in which 60 million people were slaughtered, 1/10 of them Jews. 1 out of every 3 Jews alive in the world at that time was killed. Not because of anything they did, but because of who they were. The Hebrew language has no word for survivor. But it has another word that can most closely be described in comparison to the English word remnant, to what remains, to what is left over after something is taken away, and therefore to something that is incomplete, that is not separated, to something that is not whole, to something that yearns to be reunited, never can be. This sense of loss, this sense of being apart from others, this awareness of one's incompleteness, this sense of emptiness gave me a consciousness of not being like others. That was reinforced in a multitude of ways every day as I grew up, as a child. And not only on special occasions such as Holocaust Education Week, which incidentally is presently being commemorated until tomorrow. My childhood developed a geographical, a cultural, and a linguistic specificity. My parents, who escaped from Poland to Russia 3 months before the Nazis' invasion of Poland, where their ancestors had lived for centuries, moved me and my brother from resettlement camps in Germany, then to Israel or Palestine. then to Canada, exposing us to 3 countries, 3 cultures, 3 languages, and 3 ways of seeing the world and trying to understand our place in it. Changing countries more often than shoes, I always felt immersed in a sense of otherness, being l'étranger éternel, of seeing afresh for the first time what others raised from infancy in static environments and been socialized and enculturated to accept uncritically, if only because of the banality of daily existence and repetition. As a child, I looked at the world with a sense of wonderment, with a sense of guilt at being alive, but still being alive, or being spared, and therefore with a sense that everything was possible, that nothing had to be the way it was, and everything could be different. After all, every one of my cousins, from the 10 brothers and 10 sisters of my parents that should have been part of my extended family, every one that should be breathing and seeing and feeling and sharing and taking joy in discovering a world that was full of magic, unlike them, shadows, existing only in my mind, but very real to me. I was alive. I was breathing. I was seeing. I was feeling. I was discovering. So my very existence was experienced as the antithesis to those who did not exist. And therefore, my very existence was experienced as an existential joy, as a conquest, as a victory, and as an achievement. But with one string attached. It also had a sense of obligation. Maybe my generation or relatives were erased by history, but I was not erased. Maybe at night, trying to sleep, the ghosts of others like me who should have been there but weren't came to visit my mind and asked me to live their lives that they themselves could not live through me. And I listened to their pleadings at night. And in the daytime, I took great joy in letting them live their lives through me. Sometimes, many times, I had forgotten my father, when he was alive, reminded me. I cried myself to sleep, thinking thoughts that did not belong in the mind of a child. When I woke and went into the world, these ghosts were with me, seeing through me, breathing through me, feeling through me. My life belonged to them as much as to me. My sense of self was inseparable from the apparitions, numerous in number, although voiceless, although nameless, although faceless, yet through me, melding our identities, although lost in the mist of the past, in the fog of war. They found their voices, their faces, their names through me. Even now, as you listen to me, you also listen to them. And the words you hear are their words as much as they are mine. So I began to understand as a child where I stood, where I fitted in, what my identity was, and what my role was. My role was to prevent the tragedy that befell them from ever happening again. My role was to prevent war that consumed life from ever consuming anyone else again, to prevent the destruction of future generations which may be denied the most fundamental right of all, the right to life. Until the souls of the ghosts that haunted me were at peace, I could not be at peace. I had to live for them and to create a world where no one else would suffer their fate. to some of you, this may appear to be a very ambitious task, maybe a near impossible one. After all, others have tried to realize the goal that I set myself, but have not yet entirely been successful. And some may argue that the achievement of such a goal by a child might even be more improbable. But for me, the drive to fulfill this goal was without boundaries. My thirst for a world of peace and justice was unquenchable, and the need to achieve my goal at the present, in my day, in my moment, with continence, no compromise. It was never a matter of choice. It was a matter of necessity. It was never a matter of could this goal be realized. It had to be realized. The recognition of necessity was, to me, the key to my self-realization, to my personal fulfillment, a key to giving my life meaning and direction. At a very early age, I finally knew my place in the world. Logically, the next question in my mind during this time when I felt alone and I had no one else to share my secret with was to figure out how to realize this ambitious goal. There were two things that I needed. I needed to understand the world I was born into, from top to bottom and inside out. The first thing I needed to amass was information, raw data, and facts that would allow me to accumulate and absorb the experience of humanity in the social and natural sciences, as it was known in the middle of the last century. And then I needed to have knowledge and understanding and a coherent interpretation of the facts and experience gained through observation and study. Schools and libraries were, for me, the locus for acquiring both information and knowledge. My mind was like a sponge. I skipped grade 2 to 4, even though I came to Canada in grade 1. I could barely speak English. I skipped grade 5 to 7. In grade 4, my report card says I was a deep thinker. In grade 5, my report card says that I made interesting contributions to the social studies class. I was 12 years old in grade 9. And by that time, I had read more than 1,000 books before I became a teenager. I sensed that I needed to know everything, and I also sensed that I needed to know everything about everything. That was the rather immodest standard that I set for myself. There was another major influence in my life: politics. It was during this time, the 1950s, that I was first exposed to the social and political inequities in society. I was what was called then a red diaper baby. I remember marching with my parents in front of the U.S. consulate on University Avenue to protest the persecutions of Morton Sobel, now 97 years old, and the execution of Julian and Ethel Rosenberg on June 19th, 1953. I was not even 7 years old at that time. The moral strength of two people who gave up their lives willingly because they refused to name names at the height of McCarthyism became to me, as I grew older, a shining example of the kind of determination to principle and sacrifice that was needed to change this world. I would have given my life in a second if I could turn back the clock and snap the leather straps that tied the Rosenbergs to the electric chairs. The greatest heroes at that time, for me, were Capo and Vanzetti. To workers were executed in Chicago because they were wrongly accused of placing a bomb and went to their deaths, expressing the feeling that they were happy to do so, if that's the price they had to pay for their beliefs. Every August 6th and 9th, both as a child and later as a teenager and adult, for decades, I pounded the pavement on University Avenue again in commemoration of the destruction caused by the nuclear bombing of the civilian populations of Hiroshima and Nagasaki after Japan had already agreed to unconditional surrender. The agenda of the US military was not, as portrayed in propaganda at that time, to achieve peace, but it was to test the impact of a nuclear fireball on wooden structures, a test that turned living, breathing, pulsating, caring, loving, innocent civilian babies, children, women, and men into disintegrated shadows. 110,000 people killed immediately. 170,000 people dead within 4 months. Countless injured and suffering the cruel effect of radiation poisoning and mutilation for the rest of their shortened, miserable lives. As I grew older, now without the presence of my parents, I attended throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s countless demonstrations by the anti-nuclear war movement, by the Canadian Peace Congress, by the Canadian Committee for the Control of Radiation Hazards, by the Toronto Peace Council, by the Student Union for Peace Action, by the Voice of Women, by the Combined Universities Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, by the Canadian Students for Nuclear Disarmament, and innumerable other groups against the threat of nuclear war, against the use of nuclear weapons during the Kennedy Missile Crisis, and for nuclear disarmament. I demonstrated against the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba by the CIA-backed paramilitary goons on April 17th, 1961. On December 11th, 1962, at 12:02 a.m., 2 days before my birthday, my 16th birthday, I marched with dozens of others in front of the Don Jail to protest the last hangings in Canada of 2 men. Both of them were rushed to justice within a year of charges being laid. Amidst the public furor in Toronto, after a cop was shot in an unrelated case, Arthur Lucas, a black man appears to have been framed in uncircumstantial evidence in the absence of a fair trial, represented by an inexperienced lawyer doing his first trial, who also believed Lucas to be set up in a case that is currently condemned by the Association for the Defense of the Wrongly Convicted. It was an icy cold and freezing night, and I remember the searing and blistering wind through my jacket and my sense of horror that a human being would have his life taken away in the name of justice. It was only revealed in 1986 that I learned that Lucas's execution was especially cruel, botched by miscalculation by the hangman of his weight. By the mid to late 1950s, I had already developed a profound sense of social consciousness and political awareness, best described as humanism. I gave my first speech to an audience of Landsmann, a group of Jewish immigrants, when I was 10 years old, and I gave it in Yiddish. I had become politicized, and the issue that politicized me was the Second World War. I want to share with you what I learned at that time. My mind was ready to be leavened, and my primary interests were in science, in history and philosophy, and I read biographies by the dozen. This is what I learned. I learned that in both the natural and social world, as well as in art, there were laws. I learned that having knowledge, instead of just information, involved discovering through experiment what those laws were. I learned that everything that exists, whether in the natural or the social sphere, is in a constant change of evolution, transformation, and change. That time is a measure of change, and that you never put your foot in the same river of time twice. I learned that everything that exists changes. I learned that while mastering the laws that govern phenomena is essential to understanding reality, that even the laws that we discover that explain behavior, whether animate or inanimate, on a practical scale, are themselves limited. I learned that no eternal truisms exist. Laws that we can rely on one scale may obscure reality on another. I learned that there were no sacred gods, no timeless verities, revelations that are immutable and unchanging. I also learned the truth lies in an open mind, ready to abandon the most hallowed shibboleths. I learned that what individuals through their own efforts can come to understand as paltry compared to the insights and understandings that flow from the interface, from the cross-pollination with thoughts and ideas of others. I learned that while it was possible to be a positive catalyst in the process of social change, there is nothing more feeble than the force of one. I learned that to better the fate of humanity, one must struggle collectively. I learned that the essential character of human beings is social. And ultimately, all the social ills of human societies over the last 10,000 years, war, exploitation, material want and deprivation, xenophobia, injustice, discrimination, dictatorship, misogyny, ignorance, inequality, violence, and hate stem when one person or group of persons seek to advance their perceived material interests at the expense of another or others, at the cost of denial of the benefits of social production equally to all. I learned that personal aggrandizement foists hierarchical structures where those on the highest rungs monopolize wealth and power only by denying it to others. I learned that the higher you stand economically in the human pyramid, the more people you have to step on and clamber over to get to the pinnacle. I learned that everyone tries their best. I learned to feel the pain of others as my own. I learned that ultimately, individual liberties requires a collective effort where the rights of one cannot be denied without the rights of all also being denied. And the rights of one cannot be guaranteed without the rights of all being guaranteed. I learned that what brings us together is much more important than what differences we have, than what drives us apart. I learned that the difference between the best of us and the worst of us was insignificant. I learned that equality does not mean that every one of us is the same, and that individual rights does not mean negation of collective rights. That can only be ultimately realized through cooperation. I learned that the ideas that people have, their awareness of themselves and others, their attitudes to social, to political, to moral, and to personal issues are shaped profoundly, thoroughly, inflexibly, rigidly by their own experiences, by their positions in the social hierarchy, by their jobs, by their prospects, by their perceptions of their own needs and interests, and the influences of those who work with them, who associate with them, whose financial interests they share, whose ambitions they share, those who live in their neighborhoods, go to their schools, dine at their tables, and engage in the same digital activities that they do. That's where their awareness and their attitudes and their social, political, and moral and personal attitudes develop. But this was not an easy lesson for me to learn. I very, very naively used to believe that everybody was logical, everybody was a computer, everybody was rational. If I could just talk to people, if I could just share with them what I understood, how could they not agree with me? I couldn't believe that that there was one person in this world that I not could convince of what I understood to be true. I used to believe that if I spoke to a person and they saw themselves as rational, I would be able to convince them simply through logic, simply through deductive and inductive thinking, simply from accepting a few a priori principles or assumptions that we both shared. I could convince them of a whole series of views and positions that flowed logically from the principles. Sometimes I'd grab somebody and want to hug them and hold them for a whole day and just tell them everything that I knew. And then would come out a carbon copy. It didn't work that way. How wrong I was. How fixed, how unchanging, how deep-rooted are the attitudes and biases that people are ingrained with. People cling to the attitudes that they hold and the conclusions that they have arrived at through their own limited experiences and perceptions to such an extent, often, mostly unconsciously, always by habit, that a mountain of logic cannot outweigh their uncritically developed predispositions. I have now concluded that for all practical purposes, it is impossible to reach those people from an abstract exposition that they cannot relate to their own daily routine experiences. Sometimes you can convince people through talk, but usually only by telling them stories. And they have to be stories that they can relate to. Most people won't alter their perceptions until they see themselves in their stories. And soon I will tell you a little bit more about my story. Does somebody have a glass of water?
It's on its way.
Oh, thank you so much. Perfect timing. I hope I'm not boring you. I learned the truth, not faculty truth that does not exist, but truth in the moment, truth on the right scale, truth as a guide to action, understanding the inner and often contradictory nature of reality, whether social or natural, comes from a critical attitude. Criticism, long-lived criticism, criticism of all that exists, unbridled criticism, unmitigated criticism, unrelenting criticism of what others in society may call common sense, or what is obvious, or what is accepted, or what is understood, or what is given. Truth comes by challenging the ingrained unconscious assumptions that we all take for granted. Only through ruthless criticism of all that exists might we, perchance, find the nuggets of a transitional truth by taking a long view of history through the lens of such furious criticism. And then I learned something else. I learned that I could find myself through action. It was during this time also, my youth, that I began to see my own life and my whole own life, not only as a horizontal solidarity with others whose lives have been scarred by injustice, but also vertically with those who in the past stood up against injustice and the lives of those who oppress and exploit them. Who did I identify with and who did I choose to emulate? Who inspired me? I saw my life consonant with and a continuation of what others had achieved. My heroes were Spartacus, Socrates, Robespierre, Galileo, Thomas Paine, William Lyon Mackenzie, Chief Poundmaker, Louis Riel, and others, reaching into the future of humanity. Within my soul reverberated his famous words of Eugene Vidal's, which in their terseness encapsulated the meaning of my own life. Years ago, I recognized my kinship with all living things. I said then, I say now, where there's a lower class, I am from it. Where there's a criminal element, I am of it. Where there's a soul in prison, I am not free. The single most important lesson that I learned was that the most brilliant ideas meant nothing if they were not translated into action. That the deepest thoughts were arid unless they were understood as a guide to action. And that only through collective action, only through convincing others to join you, could you actually effect change. All of us or none. Was I born to organize? Was I born to educate? Was I born to be part of a leadership? These were never questions that I asked myself. I did what I had to do. Freedom was a recognition of necessity. Doing what was necessary was fulfilling to me in a way that gave me a great sense of inner strength. More than happiness, it gave me joy. It empowered me beyond imagination. There's something else that was very important that I learned at this time. And that was that I also discovered that I was not alone. I bonded with everyone who had a thirst to do what was right. I became a warrior. From the age of 12 on, I went to battle. In high school, I led a successful campaign to make military cadet training optional instead of compulsory at Oakwood Collegiate. While in high school, I led a sit-down to protest the playing of God Save the Queen every morning. I organized a successful campaign to lower the price of milk in high school cafeterias in York Township. I participated in a Toronto-wide campaign to reinstate a student expelled from Jarvis Collegiate because his hair was too long. It was the 1950s, after all. I won the right to have the first political party club at Toronto High School. In 1963, when we were forced to participate in a drill on what to do in case of a nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis, hiding under our desks with our hands covering our heads, I, along with others, organized a boycott of the drill, and with others got to our school before 8 a.m. and plastered the hallways of our school with signs that contained slogans such as "Build schools, not bombs," and "Boycott the drill." The principal of Von Road was not amused. I went to both York University and University of Toronto. In both of those universities, I ran for presidencies of the Student Council. I ran on a platform of student power and faculty, student, and support staff control of the universities. We drove Dow Chemical, the maker of napalm, out of the recruitment offices. We called for kicking big business off the boards of governors at the universities. I was active in the crusade to end the war in Vietnam, helping to organize and build the massive demonstrations that helped end the war in the late 1960s. At this time, I was active in the Young New Democrats, president of the U of T Socialist Club, organized meetings where student leaders from Mexico came to describe and protest the slaughter of hundreds of students in Mexico City by the army. When they were protesting against the government in 1967, I organized meetings for the leaders who were fighting for Miguel Frances, and organized meetings for invited speakers to U of T, like the Marxist philosopher George Novak, literary critic Irving Howe, and numerous others. At Oscar Hall, 300 students came to hear Dr. Gustavo Tolentino, a Toronto doctor who went to Vietnam to document the effect of radiation from US missiles and bombs on civilians there by the United States on behalf of the International War Crimes Tribunal headed by British philosopher Bertrand Russell. I noticed, by the way, in the audience, a person who I knew in Canada who went to England and worked with Bertrand Russell as his right-hand man in the International War Crimes Tribunal, Ernie Tate. It's nice when you see people 50 years later you fought for the same ideas with. I lived and breathed politics 24 hours a day. I helped initiate the faculty committee on Vietnam headed by Professors Chandler Davis and world-famous pianist Anton Puerte. You may have read in the papers recently, 2 weeks ago, that he appears to have had a stroke during a concert in Miami. I participated in demonstrations in solidarity with the drive to sign up black voters in the southern United States to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. I took part and spoke at some of the massive rallies against Canada's complicity in the war in Vietnam. I participated in a teaching at U of T. I remember having the bullhorn. I remember standing on the steps of Convocation Hall. I remember there was 100 people around me when I started giving my speech on the bullhorn. And I remember that there were 1,000 people around me when I finished giving my speech into the bullhorn. I guess somebody was listening. Maybe my voice was very loud. I wrote articles. I handed out leaflets. I went on marches. I wrote a syndicated column, which was copied in several school newspapers throughout Canada. The column was called The Inside Agitator. I had a beard and a gun and a cartoon there, my column. I also spoke at virtually every major campus in the country, from Memorial University in Newfoundland to the University of British Columbia in 1970, on a cross-country speaking tour. And then I had to make a decision about what profession I would follow in my life. I'm talking about the attraction of law. When it came to choose a profession, I was attracted to law the way a moth is attracted to light. How could it be otherwise? As a social institution, the judicial system portrays its purpose to be to defend and extend fundamental human rights and civil liberties of all people, to promote equality, to promote fairness, to give everyone the right to obtain justice irrespective of their financial or social standing. I realized that law was a tool used by those with privilege and power to pound the rest of us into submission. I knew that the courts were an integral part of a system that was used to break strikes, to pass injunctions, to criminalize dissidents, to enforce unjust laws, to sanctify existing power relations and property relations, and to protect the status quo. That is, to protect those who have and those who haven't. How did Anatole France put it? Quote, "In its majestic equality, the law forbids rich and poor alike to sleep under bridges, beg in the streets, and steal loaves of bread. Ah, the magical majesty of the law." I also knew that there were senior appeal judges who had been politicians 30 years earlier, cabinet ministers who in their previous incarnations as cabinet ministers in the federal government of Mackenzie King refused asylum to German Jews escaping from Nazi Germany into Canada. In 1939, the SS St. Louis that was carrying 978 refugees seeking asylum from Nazi persecution was turned away by the King government in Canada back to Germany, where 1/4 of them died in the concentration camps of Auschwitz and Sobibor. The phrase used at that time with respect to Jewish immigration was, "None is too many." The political and legal elites that dominate Canada's traditional social institutions do not have clean hands. They dare to speak. They dare to speak of the law as an instrument for equality, for tolerance, for fairness, and for equity. How can I not be attracted to this institution if only to compel it to live up to its pretensions? If the law could be used to oppress people, the law could also be used as a hammer to shape and reshape society and to provide real justice, to provide meaningful equality. When I attended at Osgoode Hall Law School and the University of Toronto Law School, I went to both. I took the initiative in organizing the Law Union of Ontario, an organization of the bar that still exists. And Gord mentioned that. How did that happen? In 1970, I woke up, turned on the radio, and heard that Prime Minister Trudeau had proclaimed the War Measures Act, suspending all civil liberties because of the so-called Quebec crisis. We were concerned that our right to protest had been wiped out overnight. I immediately contacted several lawyers that I had worked with on political issues and human rights issues, people like Paul Copeland and Clay Ruby. Within 48 hours, on October 15th, 1970, we organized a demonstration of close to 750 people at the City Hall Square in downtown Toronto in the first public protest against the War Measures Act. I played a role, a spark for that demonstration. In the 1960s and the 1970s, there was radicalism in the air. There was a spirit of rebellion, a youth and student radicalization, a leavening of society, a growing tolerance of openness, tolerance of criticism. There was a sharp edge of second-wave feminism, of the struggle for equality, of fighting against authority, out of belief that a new world was possible. What could be a more propitious place for somebody who wanted equality, justice, and civil liberties in the halls of courthouses across Canada? I decided that I had to play an agitational role from within the heart of the monster. Before I even became a lawyer, the RCMP Security Service, as I discovered 50 years later during a visit to the Ottawa Archives, had a dossier on me that was 937 pages long. I consider that an achievement. I was a veteran and not even yet begun to fight. I was already public enemy #1. In the first 10 years of my practice of law, I developed a client base among tenants, young people suffering from the criminal justice system, minorities, disabled people, trade unionists, women, gays and lesbians, elderly, and every other constituency that was normally excluded from the courts of this country. The only people that I did not act for were organized crime and big business. Not that I ever saw much of a difference between them. I never waited for the good cases. Every case was a good case. If you wait for the good cases to make new law, you can wait till hell freezes over. If I lost a case, I appealed it. If I lost the appeal, I appealed it again. I never gave up. I became an expert appeal lawyer. Every client's rights were of equal importance to me. I made the law work for my clients. I reshaped it, and I bent it, and I twisted it, and I tweaked it, and I hammered it until it served my client's interests. Because the law is inalienable. The law is a river. The law is whatever a judge decides. And the law is never the same in every case. I never asked myself, when I went to court, what is the law? I asked myself, what should the law be? I wanted to make the courts abide by the laws that flowed from their own stated principles. I exacerbated contradictions and let the pieces fall where they may. I was shocked, not many lawyers shared my ideals. Even some members of the law union, whose numbers multiplied to 300 members from 1970 and 1975. This is an organization that I conceived, I approached people, I built, I organized the earliest meetings and kept going. Even those people eventually felt pressures from the system. They were a base for me, but they became absorbed in the system as judges in the lower courts, as functionaries in quasi-judicial boards or trade unions. The law union over time lost its mettle as a fighting organization as it was originally conceived to be over the years. The system has a way of grinding down lawyers who are anti-establishment, of isolating them, of frightening them, of neutralizing them, of buying them out, and sometimes even chewing them up and spitting them out. I was aware of my vulnerability as a radical in a conservative profession, but I was also aware of the leavening atmosphere that characterized the 1970s when public interest in the judicial system was at its height, influenced by the radicalization of the 1960s. People still wanted more control over their lives and their institutions. Part of the heritage of the 1960s youth rebellion, the news media in particular, the ordinary state Globe and Mail, saw one of its functions to moderate the obsessive conservatism of the judges, which were often completely out of touch with social reality. Judges were often completely out of touch with what the average person was thinking. For me, in every case, it was even a major victory just to get a judge to enforce existing laws or interpret existing laws in a reasonably consistent manner with fundamental jurisprudential principles. I once identified 75 legal decisions that I was able to obtain in the first 10 years of my law practice that changed the law for tenants, for minorities, for people discriminated against, for workers. And I was able to do that despite the fact that my clients routinely met a frosty reception from the learned judiciary. Let me give you one example. In the 1960s and 1970s, Wheel-Trans was privately owned by Allway Transportation Limited, Nick Comsa. It was a profit-making operation. Wheel-Trans was supposed to pick up disabled people and drive them to other places where they want, and you know how important transportation is for disabled people. Wheel-Trans was private, even though the TTC was coordinating the pickups. And everything was coordinated through them, but it was operated privately. And the people who drove those decrepit yellow buses were university students who were paid $1 above the minimum wage and worked 13-hour days without any training on how to deal and help disabled people. And they had no rights, and the transportation services were completely, the Velcro was gone on the belts. In some cases, rust had eaten out the bottom of the buses. This is what was given by the TTC to the public, to the disabled people, 5% of our population. And I was approached by some of those workers, and they said, "Harry, can you help us?" And I was also approached by some of the users of those buses, disabled people, and they said, "Harry, can you help us?" And during the 1970s, right into the 1980s, I did what I could to change the whole system. I remember going out to Markham, where there was the depot for all the buses that were being used, 50 or 60 of them, and I remember going behind the building, the administration building. I remember 75 employees all passing the hat and dropping $10 or $20 into it and giving it to me and telling me, "Harry, solve our problem." And I remember what started as almost a 7 or 8 year campaign to unionize those workers, to give them security, to give them proper training. I remember a campaign that I started in order to improve the quality of the buses, to get them dumped and replace them with proper buses. Every single time that an accident took place on a wheel-trans bus operated privately by Allway Transportation Limited and the COMSA, I would lay charges in criminal court against the CTC for criminal negligence. And every time a worker was fired for trying to organize a union and go into the Amalgamated Trade Union, Amalgamated Transit Union, Local 113, I would go to the Labor Board and would fight their cases and get them their jobs back. And I carried on the campaign publicly, and there were newspaper articles. And I worked with Beryl Potter, who only had one hand, from Scarborough Awareness. And I participated in demonstrations, and I spoke at conferences year after year after year after year with criminal charges, with union drives, with public demonstrations, with articles that appeared in the front page of the Toronto Star, speaking at conferences. It took 7 years, but we were eventually able to organize every single worker. We were eventually able to get the TTC to accept them as direct employees. We were eventually able to get those buses replaced by proper safe buses. And I used every possible legal technique, civil law, criminal law, sued the TTC for injury when people were involved in an accident, continuing to lay criminal charges, continuing to defend workers who were fired for trying to organize a union. It took us 6 or 7 years, but we were eventually able to do it. And that was just one example of the kind of work It just came to me spontaneously, because Gord mentioned it earlier. One of the workers came to me and said, "Harry, how can I get another job? The guy just fired me, and it's on my record that I was fired." So I told the Labor Board, tell the boss to erase any suggestion that it was fired. Indicate that he worked continuously and he was the best worker there, and the TTC and the Labor Board went along with me, and they changed their work records. That's what I was able to do. Many of my cases during this time involved lawsuits against the government, against the police, against major corporations, against individuals and institutions which usually had the money to buy justice. But my cases had drama, and my cases were always David and Goliath, and my cases made new laws. True, I was in a hostile milieu, so a major equalizing aspect of my strategy was to win public support. I therefore issued press releases and contacted reporters in the news media who were interested in explaining the significance of my cases to the development of the law and in the interest of the public at large. At this time, please remember, newspapers still have reporters. It's not like it is right now. They actually had reporters, and some of these reporters were very open-minded. They'd worked on student papers in the 1960s. They were influenced by radicalization, and we'll get on the phone and we'll explain to them the significance of the cases that I was doing, which the social significance, the legal significance, and they would listen, and I was able to convince them. And hardly a week went by in the late 1970s and the early 1980s in Toronto, in the Toronto papers, in the Star, in the Globe and Mail, in the Sun, whatever papers that were there. Hardly a week went by when there wasn't at least 1 or 2 stories about my clients' cases during that time. Altogether, over a 10-year period, there were 1,000 articles about cases that I was fighting in the Toronto papers, reporting to Toronto papers, and think of all the television time, of all the radio time, of all the interviews. I was using the media to help to create a profile so I could protect myself. So the public was aware of the work that I was doing. So when the legal elite came after me, at least people would know the real reason why they came after me. There would be 2 stories about 2 separate cases in the papers at the same time, the same day, with public awareness and editorial comment focusing attention on the election, on the decisions made by the judges. There was a greater likelihood of my clients being treated fairly, despite the financial, social, and social inequality of my clients and those they were litigating against. Some people attacked me for politicizing the courts, as if the courts were not already quintessentially political. That's not what happened to fish for swimming in water. I never asked a judge to do anything more than actually enforce the law. Between 1974 and towards the late 1980s, I also was adopted by the news media, especially the Globe and Mail, believe it or not, which called me a, quote, a perennial thorn in the side of the justice system. And you have to understand that socially the newspapers play a different role from the courts. The courts do tend to be isolated. The courts do tend to be male. The courts do tend to be ultra-conservative and very political. The newspapers have to at least respond to some public, are more sensitive to public perception. Even a paper that's conservative like the Globe and Mail has always stood up for individual rights and freedoms. And I was, and they adopted me and my cases, and the examples my cases gave of a means of pressuring the courts to be more responsive, more consistent, so they wouldn't lose any credibility. And that's why I was able to get 3 dozen cases of mine that broke on the front pages of the Globe and Mail and Star during a 10-year period. I did more than just fight cases. I mean, man, oh man, I was a revolutionary, right? So I can't just go to court. I had to prove my credentials. People will say, hey, Harry, you're just a lawyer. So in addition to specific cases, I mobilized 30 lawyers who offered to volunteer $300,000 worth of their time to the Federal Solicitor General's Department, which claimed it didn't have the time or resources to prosecute RCMP lawbreakers who were identified by the Federal McDonald Commission as being into RCMP wrongdoing as having committed crimes. That's what the Federal Solicitor General's Attorney General said. Solicitor General said they didn't have the resources to prosecute the RCMP. I was able to get 30 lawyers, all criminal lawyers, Claire Ruby and so on, who volunteered $300,000 of their time to do the prosecution. Our offer was not accepted. I presented a petition and made submissions on behalf of 40 lawyers to the Law Society to take disciplinary action against Solicitor General Robert Kaplan for advising the RCMP Security Service agents that they could break provincial laws to plant listening devices in private homes. The Law Society was not interested. I uncovered an attempt by the Ontario Attorney General's office to block an independent investigation into police abuse in the Metropolitan Toronto Police Force. One case that I had broke out in the front pages of the Toronto paper, the headline articles. The keeping case, I recorded 2 police officers on the force for 10 years who threatened my client to give them names of heroin dealers and so on, or else they would frame him on some minor charges. And I recorded 5.5 hours of their threats against him and how they could manipulate the legal system to get him to jail for 5 years if he didn't cooperate with them. And when the cops were on the stand and they finished giving their evidence, and I took my ghetto blaster and I put it on the table, you could see the blood draining down their faces. 77 times they denied saying statements that I had documented in their own voices. The judge who heard the case like this acquitted my client and directed those 2 cops to be charged with perjury, which they were, and they were found guilty. That's the kind of way I practice. I fought cases which enlarged or defended the rights of women, of youth, of tenants, of retirees, of the disabled, of trade unionists, of blacks, of gays, of anti-war activists, prisoners, youth, and political dissidents. My own, and you've already heard about the Damien case, the first gay rights case in Canada, the second gay rights case in North America, the McDonald case, which established that women could not be fired from employment because of their sex, the Dvorak case, which declared restrictions on a lawyer's right to contact the news media unconstitutional and gave lawyers the right to advertise. A little favor that I did for legal profession so they can advertise now on park chairs. They never thank me officially. I fought the Gay Alliance versus Vancouver Sun case, which is considered to be the leading freedom of the press case in the last 60 years, and the Wilson case, the largest rent abatement award to tenants in Canadian history. I led and organized delegations and petitions on issues as diverse as the defense of the leaders of Solidarność in Poland and the defense of Dr. Henry Morgenthaler. My activities in the courts in the 1970s and 1980s, as I mentioned, gave me a profile that is not unnoticed by the powers that be. And that profile was reinforced. I wrote articles for law journals about my cases. I wrote half a dozen articles for the Globe and Mail, op-ed articles. I wrote several articles in other specialized legal papers. I saw myself as an educator, and I had to educate, both through speaking, both through using my cases as an example, and both by writing. I had to share my knowledge. During this time, I spoke frequently at law schools across the province of Ontario, even outside of Ontario. During this time, big law was keeping an eye on me. Nothing really happened until I really stepped into it. And that was, you saw earlier, the Dawson case. Everything was a build-up to that one case that brought me to major public prominence and made me a direct personal target of the legal establishment. On December 17, 1985, the Ontario Attorney General Ian Scott charged me with criminal contempt of court for saying that the courts are worked in favor of protecting the police and that the RCMP and the courts are stuck so close together, you'd think they would put together with crazy glue. Did I speak in anger? They tell me that that's the official story. But if I could share a secret with you, which I promise not to tell anybody, it's the first time I've ever revealed it. And I'm not sure it's a wise thing to do. But I didn't want them to bury the case. And I said, you know, maybe what I should do is say something that I know might get them to feel a little uncomfortable. So it was not spontaneous anger. It was a mischievous Filipino. I decided and thought about what people say to make sure that the case would not go away. So it wasn't so much in anger. They taught me a lot of things in law school. They taught me a lot of things in the legal profession. And one was that you stage things. So the shit hit a fan. They actually came to my office, and Mr. White was at the door. My secretary said to me, show him in. You know, he must be a client. He comes in. I said, I only have half an hour. He said, this won't take very long. And he took out a piece of paper. He said, Mr. Kopyto, I'm here to serve you from the Attorney General's office. And he said, what is this? And I read a notice of motion to have me cited for contempt for scandalizing the court and permit me to jail. I looked at it and said, scandalizing the court? What's that? I committed a crime that I didn't even know existed. I soon found out that it did exist. The idea that a person could face a jail sentence for expressing a view critical of perceived injustices is abhorrent to a civilized community. It's so offensive to freedom of expression. A fearless and independent bar is critical to the survival of our judicial system. Lawyers who are afraid to speak out against injustices could do little to uphold or improve the quality of justice in this country. Remember when I made that statement, you saw the Fifth Estate program. My statement was made after 8 years trying to litigate against 2 former senior RCMP officers who admitted before the McDonald Commission responsibility for committing criminal acts, circulating phony messages within an organization that I've been a member of for the purpose of disrupting it, a legitimate legal labor and socialist group in Toronto in the early 1970s, and they were targeted by a dirty tricks campaign. And could somebody get me a glass of water?
Working on it.
We're working on it.
A leader of that group, I had to get justice. I did it according to their rules. First of all, I went to the federal court, I went to the provincial criminal courts, I went to the Supreme Court of Canada, and I even went to the United Nations Human Rights Committee. I had a total over 70 court appearances in a period of 8 years, and 2 RCMP officers who were admitted before a federal commission they had committed criminal acts. I could not get them charged. So finally, I went to small claims court, and finally, Judge Super said, they were just doing their duty. That reminded me of something about the defense the Nazis used in 1946 in Nuremberg. I didn't like it. Even though, thank you. Despite not being able to get them charged, I was able to use the judicial system, the Royal Commissions, the Creever Commission, the Royal Commission, the MacDonald Commission, all these commissions and all those court cases. It resulted in the uncovering before 2 Royal Commissions of the existence of a massive secret RCMP operation codenamed Checkmate, and before that Oddball, which included falsifying income tax returns, blackmail, break-ins, and psychological terrorism against dissidents. By the way, I won't go into this at all, it was also directed against me personally. And the RCMP had come to visit my mother when she was suffering from a neurological illness and to pressure on me through her. And there were a few other incidents that I now can trace back clearly to RCMP dirty tricks. My motivation was political, not personal. So we revealed these dirty trick campaigns. We revealed a unanimous, I also achieved, because I couldn't lay charges against the RCMP, and the Attorney General blocked even the Justice of the Peace deciding to lay the charges, even hearing the charges, and deciding whether they should be charged. I had to go to the Supreme Court of Canada to get that right. And I ended up having a very significant case, Dawson versus the RCMP, in 1987, upholding the historic right of private prosecution. This same government that did everything possible to block the prosecution of the RCMP then suddenly showed amazing enthusiasm for charging me with contempt of court. And I don't want to speak too much about it, but I want to tell you some details that may not have been picked up there. 27 different lawyers wrote me and wanted to go on the record. 27. Man, oh man, that's a lot of lawyers. One day, 8 of them showed up before a judge to start dating. And the judge said, what, is this a reunion or what? You know? Who's everybody here? You don't see black robes. That's the kind of support that I was able to get during this time period. And you can imagine, we put the system on trial. We put the system on trial, and there was a trial every single day, front page news, and I'm being prosecuted. RCMP in crime, and then got charged here in Kopyto, protest against it, but he's going to go to jail for 5 years. That's what happened. The RCMP case, my battle against the RCMP, it was so egregious, the refusal of the government to charge them, that we were able to get international support for that case. And much of that also got transferred in my defense. And some of the same people who supported the Dawson case against the RCMP, they included people like Linus Pauling, Benjamin Spock, British literary giant Jessica Mitford, Noam Chomsky. They also came behind us. You can see the kind of broad support that we had. It was an exciting trial. I subpoenaed the Attorney General to question him on why it was that I was charged. At one time, Charlie Roach wasn't saying exactly what I wanted to say, and I got carried away, in quotes, and I jumped out of the prisoner's box. And I ran up, and I pushed him aside, and I wanted to speak to the court. And that was on the front pages for 2 days of all 4 pages. I wanted to keep interest going, you know. It was an exciting trial, but what happened was that Justice Montgomery was a hitman, and he was brought in for the kill. And he found me guilty, and decided to prevent me from ever entering any courtroom in the country until I apologized to all judges for all courts, whatever that meant. And you already have seen and heard about the kind of interest that case generated, and I just want to let you know, very interestingly, that the support that I had in that fight was so broad that I became a co-celeb. And on one occasion, the University of Toronto faculty had organized a wine and cheese party in my support. And I was mentioning that fact before my Law Society current hearing. Margaret Blank was the chair of the panel, and she said, Mr. Kopyto, when did that take place? And I said, in 87, 88. And she said, oh my God, I went to your party, I supported you. And I said, oh, Ms. Blythe, then you must resign because you're biased in my favor. She chose not to accept my advice. One more comment on the Dowson case. Once I was found guilty, in order to apologize, you have to decide, am I going to appeal conviction or conviction and sentence? If we appealed my sentence, which was outrageous and would have easily been overturned, that would have given the courts an easy way out of being able to declare the law unlawful. They wouldn't have to deal with that. They wouldn't have to say that it would breach the Charter of Rights guarantee of freedom of expression. But it would open the door for me to continue to practice law. So I had to choose. What's more important, Harry's right to practice law, or getting rid of this law? And we had so much massive support, and we believed that we could win, and we decided that was a real issue, and therefore I never appealed my sentence. And the Court of Appeal, all 5 judges had to deal with it. They had to choose between letting this infamous sentence stand, which forced me to apologize, and I couldn't work for a living because of ideas, or they would have to get rid of the law. And they got rid of the law. And when that happened, it was the end. It was a turning point in my career, because then they had to get me. And I just, things developed a life of their own. And they hired a company, and they investigated over 600 accounts. I worked only for legal aid. I didn't work for people who had money. And I didn't work for people who had money to make me rich. I worked for people who needed me. And they investigated over 650 accounts that I rendered for hundreds of clients over a 3-year period. And they found little discrepancies there over phone calls. And they charged me with fraud and overbilling legal aid. And I was going to talk to you about the details of that in my defense, but there's not a lot of time. So all I'll tell you is that they had this guy, Ian Outerbridge, as the chair of the discipline committee to disbar me. And Ian Outerbridge, let's just say that his politics was not mine. He actually made statements publicly in which he described Medicare as turning the doctors into slaves. That's where his head was at. He specialized only in defending major companies, mostly US, charged with laundering money and environmental destruction and breach of safety standards. And he found me guilty, and his decision was upheld by the benchers of the Law Society. Alan Brock, who later ran for Prime Minister, or head of the Liberal Party, was the one who wrote the judgment upholding that decision by Outerbridge, and he softened it up a bit, and they ended up. I actually had a restatement of facts in which they removed the words fraud, and they said inaccurate, and they said I didn't do anything intentional, but they ended up ignoring the restatement of facts and finding me guilty, and they took away my license. But there was one Law Society bencher. His name was Tom Kerry, and he said, "Hold on, this is all wrong. You guys are ignoring the reality. And he pointed out that in fact, the complaint against me had removed any suggestion that I acted deliberately or that my accounts were inflated. And he pointed out that I tried to guess as honest as I could, the telephone calls. He pointed out that one client that took meticulous notes of all my dealings with her indicated that I failed to bill for calls and meetings that actually took place. He pointed out that I underestimated as well as overestimated some work. He pointed out that there was no dishonest intent on my part. And he pointed out that a hearing that I had for Outerbridge showed that it was biased. Outerbridge had called me histrionic, bombastic, patently dishonest, and he accused me of wanting to tear down and smash the legal process. Those were his words. And he ended up basically saying that I should not be disbarred. So this was the first time there was a written dissent in the discipline hearing before the benches of the Law Society in its 250-year history. So somebody there had the strength to tell the truth. And finally, and this is the kicker, after I was disbarred, I launched a lawsuit against a legal aid plan to repay me all the money they had frozen. And they paid it all without deducting a cent for any work that was suggested I didn't do. They wanted to get rid of me, and they framed me. That's the legal profession for you. That's a legal elite for you. It's been a long time. I want to encapsulate some things. I want to still talk a little bit about some cases, and then I'll end. When I was a lawyer, there were a lot of cases that changed the law. But the board had mentioned two of them. And one was John Damien. I mentioned it as well earlier. He was a chief steward at a racetrack. He was a man of impeccable character and honesty. He was the guy who sat there and looked at the pictures, and if the nose was 1 inch before another nose, then that horse wins and somebody gets $250,000 and somebody else loses $250,000. That's the kind of honesty he had. And they fired him because they found out that he was gay, that he had sexual relationships with a man. They found that out from the track doctor, and they fired him. And they said the reason they fired him was because because he couldn't be blackmailed. Except John Damien couldn't have been blackmailed because he never hid the fact that he was gay. They just reacted on a stereotype. It was the perfect case. In 1977, when I got them to admit that they fired him because he was gay, it broke out on the front pages of the Globe and Mail, the first gay rights case in Canada. From 1977 to 1981, we carried on a 5-year campaign to get him reinstated, to get him a compensation, and to change the law of the Ontario Human Rights Code to include a ban on discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. And John Damien became a household word. He was on television shows. There were a weekly magazine that came out with newspapers, 16 newspapers throughout Canada, 1.6 million copies of it, told a detailed story about his case. And we had fundraising activities, we had lectures, we had meetings, we had campaigns, we had demonstrations. It became the gay rights case that started it all. And without that case, there wouldn't have been any other victories. We made it the focus, and we built a movement, and we fought in court, and we won in the courts, and we won in real life. And then there was the case, the Gay Alliance Towards Equality versus the Vancouver Sun, and they came to me from British Columbia, Maurice Flood, great man, and the Vancouver Sun refused to publish a 2-line ad that said, "Buy Gay Tide," magazine for gay men and women, 50 cents for issues. They refused $2 for issues. They refused to publicize that because it said it was immoral and it was obscene. At the same time that the Vancouver Sun is publishing pictures of X-rated movies with half-clad women and so on, this ad was immoral. And that case, it went to the Human Rights Commission, and the British Columbia Court of Appeal said it was a reasonable bias against gays, and the Vancouver Sun had the right not to accept their ad, and I represented them in the Supreme Court of Canada. All the 9 judges were present, that happens once or twice a year at that time, and I argued the case. I knew the law inside out. They took a pile of papers like this, pushed them aside, stood there, and there was a 1.5-hour presentation, at the end of which, it's interesting to meet the Supreme Court of Canada. They ended up splitting 3 ways after this meeting. And what they did was, and go figure, this is the way the law works. All of a sudden, the issue wasn't the right of whether it's reasonable to discriminate against gays. The issue then became, in the minds of the majority, 5 of the 9, 4 of the 9, the issue became 5 of the 9. Does the Vancouver Sun have the right to control the content of its papers? So instead of gay rights, it became freedom of the press rights. And that Gay Alliance case ended up being hailed by everybody throughout the whole country, every law school and law professor, as the most important freedom of the press case in the last 60 years. And it became mandatory studies for everybody in first-year law school who was studying civil litigation. They knew the Gate case. Every time I went to law school, they say, "Did you do the Gate case? The freedom of the press case?" So they mystify the whole situation. You lose when you win, and you win when you lose. And not only that, but of course, because of the political campaign that we organized, that was the best known 2-line ad that was anybody ever attempted to publish in any newspaper at any time in the history of Canada. So we achieved our goal of getting the ad known, and on top of that, and this is the real kicker, within 2 months or 3 months of the Supreme Court of Canada telling us that the Vancouver Sun had the right not to publish an ad, the Vancouver Sun changed its editorial policy and published it. The courts are shadows. Real life is what counts. Those just are 2 out of several numerous cases that I fought when I was a lawyer. Let me now switch, approaching the end of my presentation, to my career since I became a paralegal. First of all, talk about chutzpah. I decided, okay, so they took my license to practice law away. Big deal. I'm still going to do it. And I'm going to do it openly. And anybody need a lawyer? I'll do all the paperwork for you. I'll find somebody to represent you. This is in defiance, complete and total defiance of Section 50 of the Law Society Act. I'm breaking the law every single time somebody comes and sees me and I do a lawyer's work. But I did it openly, I did it publicly. I didn't advertise it and give letters, but there were at least 6 articles that identified me as a lawyer for people who are in the High Court, where I'm not supposed to be. In the disclosure that the Law Society provided to me, I saw little notes from the investigation department. Mr. Kopyto admits that he's doing unauthorized practice. Send it right away to the prosecution department. I saw 3 or 4 notes like that. I was never prosecuted. Why didn't they prosecute me? Please prosecute me. I want to challenge your unfair and your abusive law that denies equal access to justice. They never wanted to prosecute me. Never. Because they knew that their law was basically just a price-fixing law. And they knew the public would come behind me. And they knew people can't afford lawyers. And they didn't want to play it out in the provincial offences courts where they don't control the process, and they do within their own law society discipline process. So that's one thing that happened to me. A very important case, and there's some people here who were involved in it. Kathy, are you still here? Kathy, oh, yeah, okay. The Claudine Charlie case, a black nurse who worked for less than 1 year for Toronto General Hospital, who had the Ontario Nurses Association, she was fired, and they said she was incompetent, and there was obvious racism, and she was politicized, and Kathy and other people were involved in a group called Nurses and Friends Against Discrimination, and they came to me because there was a stalemate, and the union wasn't able, the Ontario Nurses Association wasn't able to really push it forward, so they came to me, and they asked me to help, and for me, it's a question of principle. You know, give me $500 to cover my expenses, I'll fight your case. And I walked into that room with 7 o'clock in the evening, where the mediation was taking place. A law professor from the University of Western Ontario had been called to Toronto to mediate it. The union people were there, owner people were there. I said, out! We don't want any lawyers here. And I had 12 of her supporters. Black activists, mostly, and nurses and friends against discrimination. And right from the word go, we took a different approach to it. This was a political struggle, not a legal struggle. You know, every time you make a decision, you have a memorandum of agreement, you buy out a worker who's been fired. Every time you mediate a case, the first clause that goes there is that this will be kept confidential. I refuse to give in. This is not going to be confidential. This is going to be public. The mediator freaked out. The hospital freaked out. It's all going to be public. Yes, it's going to be public. We have nothing to hide. There's another clause they always make you sign in all these union agreements when they set up grievances, and that says that the hospital employer admits that they did nothing wrong. I said, no, we want admission that did something wrong. I was so irrational. They drove me crazy, and they ended up paying their $250,000 to get rid of me. The largest award in the history of Canada.
You sold out cheap.
I sold out cheap. I got $500. But you know what? It meant a lot more to me than doing that. Let me talk about one or two more cases. I cannot tell you how happy I am to see one person in this audience that I haven't seen for a long time. That's Mohammed. Mohammed, I'm so happy you came here. Can I talk about your case? In December 2001, Mohammed was fired. Egyptian, Islamic, brilliant nuclear scientist, working for the federal government in Deep River. One day, at the RCMP, the federal government investigator, meet with him and tell him he was fired. A few weeks after September 2001. And there were three reasons. One was, in reality, reality now. One was that he was Islamic, the other one was that he's Egyptian, and the third one. His last name was only one letter's difference from Atta, who was the person supposed to be in charge of the bombing of the World Trade Center. They had no evidence against him, none whatever. And Mohammed stood up for himself. And he said, Harry, do whatever you have to do. I must have justice. And within 2 or 3 weeks, we launched a lawsuit. We filed a complaint with the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and we went public. And we went to the politicians, and we went public, and the case broke on the front pages of the Globe and Mail, was carried to newspapers throughout Canada, became the first item on national news, both on CBC and CTV, and within 2.5 weeks, without going through the whole court system, Mohammed was reinstated, and he effectively received an apology, and he was compensated. The hysteria following the bombing in 2001. He stood up, and he stood up for himself, and we created an atmosphere where you can, if you do stand up and fight for your rights, you can even fight hysteria. Very, very important. The problems are still there. And Mohammed, the problems have not been solved, but at least this case shows that you can struggle. And he's still carrying on that fight, because there's still problems there. The last case I guess I want to mention maybe is Velma Demerson. A beautiful woman in her 80s, 90s. Velma, dear Velma. She comes knocking on my door. And she says, Harry, help me. I've been through 7 or 8 lawyers. She tells me that in 1939, they put her in jail because she married a Chinese man. Please. What are you saying? The Female Refuges Act. It was immoral. There was a law to protect women who were prostitutes or drunk in public, God forbid, Rockford, you know? Stay in the basement, okay? And married Chinese man apparently was part of what gave you an immoral character. She fell in love with him. She lived at Carlton and young, and he was in a restaurant, and they just were madly in love with each other. And her father found that out and went to their house where they were staying and dragged her before a magistrate without a trial. Gave her 1 year in jail, 1 year in a female refugees at home, she was later transferred to Merchant Reform. Well, she had a baby, with her baby, and she's coming to me in the late 1990s with a case that goes back to 1939. And what am I supposed to tell her? That the limitation period is expired, maybe. You know, I mean, you have problems enough getting a month late, let alone a decade late, let alone a century late. You know, but I told her, I'll do it. And she said, thank you. And she gave me $500. And she walked out of my home. I saw her in my second floor office. And as she locked the door, I said to myself, ay, Herschel, what did you do? You have no idea how much time I spent in the law books until I finally found a legal formula. The declarations had no time limit. That the act of the Female Refugees Act was really a criminal act dealing with crime rather than provincial interests, and therefore it was above the power of the province to actually pass that act. And I sought a decision from the court to declare that act unlawful, and I sought a declaration to that effect. And I knew that, and I sought compensation for that. And I combined that with a struggle, a public struggle. We were able to get so many people to support. We published a newsletter. We got political parties to support us. We had her participating in the Labor Day parades, riding fire engines. We had meetings, rallies, fundraisers. She had us speaking at schools, at universities, to women's groups. We formed coalitions. Eventually, we were able to get the leader of the Liberal Party, which was in opposition at that time, and to agree to, against Eves, to support her. We were able to get the NDP to support her, and eventually, when it came up to the House, after a press conference that had like 25 or 30 news media, and everybody in not in the House, but in the legislature, heard about it, and the government itself apologized. And the lawsuit we had, the Attorney General caved in and gave her a settlement, and an official apology was given to her. And that took years and years and years of political organization, of demonstrations, of legal work, and public work. And she gave a cause celebre. Everybody knew about that case. It even received international coverage. And I did that. Yeah. After they disbarred me, after they marginalized me, and I led the whole campaign from beginning to end. Was all that I ever asked you to give to me. I can talk to you about a million other cases, but let me now just tell you a few little things before we end. I want to tell you that my fight for justice continues, and that there are certain things will always be kept in my mind. I believe that every case is a good case. I believe that every injustice cries out for justice, and the justice can only be won in the courts when you mobilize and convince people to support victims of discrimination and abuse. And it's all about solidarity. And what happens in real life is what counts. And the courts can become a focus for political campaigns that can get the laws changed. And I want to tell you that it's very important to be committed against the culture of defeat, against the culture of impossibility, against the culture of cynicism, against the culture of compromise that permeates the legal profession and that says that you should always compromise, or even worse, give up without a fight. The culture of defeat has to be replaced with a culture of struggle. A culture of determination, a culture that makes the institutions of law and government live up to their own pretensions and expectations. You have to move out of the conduct zone, lawyers, You have to recognize that courage is contagious. The law is never frozen in time. The law is whatever a judge decides, it is. His or her decision is ultimately a result of the balance of forces between those fighting for justice and those maintaining injustice. The Law Society targets me for reasons, but more than any, for many reasons, but more than anything else, they target me because of my defiance, because of my insolence, because of my insistence that they abide by their own principles. The Law Society lacks respect for others who are different and for basic values of right and wrong. When you stand up against institutions like big law, it is amazing how far you can go to face them down. Justice requires us to turn despair and apathy into constructive, collaborative action. You need a vision and you need a dream. Legal rights reflect social rights. I have that dream, a dream where access to the courts is available equally to rich and poor alike, where everyone has a right to an education, to housing, and to the basic necessities of life, where everyone has a right to work and to have their basic needs met, where the wealth of society is shared and made available equally to all who need it, and where the legal system lives up to its pretensions, its proclamations with respect to access to justice, equality, and fairness. In order to accomplish great things, we need not only act, but we need also dream, not only plan, but also believe. If 50 million people say a foolish thing, it is still a foolish thing. If we know what's right in our hearts, if we set aside fear, if we get rid of cynicism, of apathy, of injustice, there is nothing that can stop us. And we'll never be ready to make nice with those who justify oppression, exploitation, and denial of fundamental rights. In real life, you face injustice in all its unmasked brutality. In the courts, you face that same injustice. It is packaged in neatly folded lies. In both instances, it can be defeated. It just takes an unquenchable thirst to do what is right. It just takes a voice to speak out. Your voice, my voice, the voices of others who should be here, the voices of others that need to be heard. Thank you.
Hey, what's up? Good, just wrapping up. Hey, how you guys doing? Oh, okay, or you should come pick me up in one.
Where's the award? Here it is. I'd like to point out that we have congratulations card to Carrie that we'd love to have you to sign.
Anyways, so just give me 15
Sign the
minutes,
back,
I'll give you a copy,
front,
okay?
inside of the card. I'm going to put it on the table at the back. So please, if you'd like to leave a message.